Daniel Whitaker had stopped believing in whispers. The kind that called a man to faith. The kind that spoke of purpose. The kind that once filled his sermons with conviction. But that was before the tragedy. Before the silence that swallowed his prayers whole. Tonight, the silence wasn't empty. A voice called his name in the dead of night, threading through the howling storm outside. It wasn't loud. It wasn't demanding. It was a whisper, steady, certain. Go. The word sent a chill through him. He didn't know where. He didn't know why. But as the past clawed at his chest and regret whispered louder than the wind, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He listened, and that decision would change everything. Before we continue with the story, take a moment to subscribe. Grab a coffee or your favorite drink as we journey into the depths of God's love, where faith is tested, prayers are answered in unexpected ways, and miracles unfold when we least expect them. Stay with us, because this story will reveal just how powerful faith can be. The wind howled through the barren trees, rattling against the windows of the old farmhouse like ghostly fingers. Inside, Daniel Whitaker sat hunched in an armchair by the dying embers of the fireplace, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. The dim glow cast flickering shadows along the walls, illuminating the dust that had long settled over forgotten shelves and unopened books. His late wife's Bible lay on the small table beside him, untouched for years. He used to preach from it, used to believe in every word. Now, it was just another relic of a life that felt foreign. He let out a slow breath, staring into the fire, watching the flames dance and curl as if whispering secrets he no longer cared to hear. The silence of the house was suffocating, but it was better than the noise of his own thoughts. He had once filled this home with laughter, prayer, and purpose. Now, only the echoes of what was lost remained. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass before downing it in one swift motion, wincing as the burn clawed down his throat. It dulled the pain, if only for a moment. His mind drifted back to the accident, the night everything shattered. The memory was a cruel thief, stealing his breath, his peace, his faith. He clenched his fists, his voice a bitter whisper. If you're there, why did you leave me? The question hung in the air, swallowed by the storm raging outside. He didn't expect an answer. He hadn't heard God's voice in years. The weight of exhaustion settled over him, and he let his eyes close, surrendering to the numbness. But just as sleep began to pull him under, a sound cut through the silence. A knock at the door. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He frowned, gripping the armrests of his chair. No one ever came out this far, not in the dead of winter, not after midnight. He hesitated before pushing himself up, his joints stiff from years of wear and sorrow. As he approached the door, another knock sounded, softer this time, almost hesitant. His hand hovered over the handle. Something in his chest tightened, an unease he couldn't name. Who would be out there in a storm like this? Taking a steadying breath, he unlocked the door and pulled it open. A gust of freezing wind rushed in, carrying flakes of snow and a presence he couldn't quite place. And standing there, shivering, was a boy no older than 15, his wide eyes searching Daniel's, as if he had been looking for him all along. The wind howled through the barren trees, rattling the old farmhouse as Daniel Whitaker sat in his worn-out armchair, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace. The past had been clawing at him all night, dragging him through memories he wanted to forget. His fingers traced the cracked spine of his late wife's Bible, a book he hadn't opened in years. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence. Daniel stiffened, his jaw tightening. No one ever came out this far, not in the dead of winter. The locals knew better. He exhaled sharply, deciding to ignore it. Probably a lost traveler who'd figure out soon enough that there was nothing for them here. Another knock. Firmer this time. Grumbling under his breath, Daniel pushed himself up and stalked toward the door. He yanked it open, cold air rushing. Inside. A teenage boy stood on the porch, shivering beneath a too-thin jacket. His brown eyes, filled with both determination and uncertainty, met Daniel's. "You're Daniel Whitaker, right?" the boy asked. Daniel frowned. "Depends who's asking." The boy hesitated, then extended a gloved hand. "I'm Ethan Carter." Daniel ignored the handshake. "What do you want?" Ethan pulled his hand back and shifted his weight. I had to come. I heard about you." A dry chuckle escaped Daniel. "Heard what? That I used to be a pastor? That I threw it all away?" He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "If you're here to fix me, kid, you're wasting your time." Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't think you need fixing. I think you need reminding." Daniel's smirk faded. "Remember what?" "That God hasn't forgotten you." A bitter scoff escaped Daniel's lips. "Yeah? Funny, because I'm pretty sure he has." Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded note. "I know you. Don't believe it, but he sent me here tonight. I don't know why. I just know I had to come." Daniel took the note out of reflex, but he didn't open it. His fingers tightened around the paper. "I should go," Ethan said, stepping back. "It's late. Just don't throw that away before you read it." Daniel watched as the boy turned and walked into the darkness, his figure disappearing into the swirling snow. With a sigh, Daniel stepped inside and shut the door. He turned the note over in his hands, debating whether to toss it into the fire. His instincts screamed that nothing good could come from opening it, but something he couldn't name, stopped him. Finally, with a reluctant breath, he unfolded the paper. Only 5 words were written inside, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "God hasn't forgotten you, Daniel." His breath hitched, his fingers trembled. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel so alone. Daniel sat frozen, the note trembling in his hands. The words blurred as memories surged like an unrelenting tide. He could still hear the doctor's voice from years ago, delivering the news that shattered his world. Could still feel the weight of his wife's Bible in his hands the night he swore he'd never pray again. But now, this boy, this stranger, had walked through the snow just to hand him a message that felt uncomfortably personal. With a sharp exhale, Daniel crumpled the note in his fist. "It doesn't mean anything," he told himself. "Just coincidence. People always said things like this, hoping to stir something in him. But God hadn't spoken to him in years. Why would he start now?" The wind moaned outside, pressing against the old farmhouse like an unwanted guest. Daniel tossed the note onto the small wooden table and stood, stretching the stiffness from his legs. He reached for the lamp, ready to shut out the world and disappear into sleep. Then he heard it. A whisper. Faint. Subtle. Almost like the wind curling through the cracks in the window frame. But it wasn't. It was a voice. Daniel. He spun around, his heart hammering. The room was empty, save for the flickering shadows cast by the fireplace. He swallowed hard, shaking his head. "You're imagining things. Lack of sleep. Too much time alone." That had to be it. But the whisper came again, closer this time. "I am with you." Daniel's breath hitched. He backed away, his heel catching on the corner of the rug. He steadied himself against the table, his pulse thudding in his ears. "No," he muttered. "No, no, no." He refused to believe it. God doesn't speak to people like me. Not anymore. But deep inside, beneath the layers of doubt and bitterness, something stirred. The whisper had felt real. Daniel sank into his chair, gripping the arms as though they could anchor him. The fire crackled, its embers glowing softly, and the wind outside seemed to die down. Silence settled over the room, but his heart was still racing. He turned his gaze to the note again. God hasn't forgotten you, Daniel. His fingers curled into fists. Maybe it was all in his head. Maybe it was just some strange coincidence. But for the first time in years, Daniel wasn't sure, and that terrified him. Daniel barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the whisper echoed in his mind. I am with you. It was impossible. It had to be. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape blanketed in untouched snow. The world outside looked clean, pure, so different from the turmoil twisting inside him. He stood by the window, staring out at the road that led into town. The boy, Sam, had left him shaken. That note, that voice. He needed answers. But where would he even begin? A sharp knock at the door made him flinch. His first instinct was to ignore it. Most visitors had long since stopped coming. But after a moment, he sighed and pulled the door open. Standing on the porch, bundled in a worn coat and thick scarf, was Margaret Atwood. Not the writer, but the elderly woman who ran the church food pantry. Her sharp gray eyes studied him, her expression unreadable. Morning, Daniel, she said. Thought I'd check on you. Haven't seen you in town much. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, well, been keeping busy. Margaret made a sound somewhere between a scoff and a chuckle. That what you call it? He didn't answer. She shifted the basket in her hands and held it out. Brought you some things, bread, eggs, and a little something extra. He hesitated but finally took it. Thanks. Margaret didn't move. She peered up at him, her gaze softer now. You look tired. Didn't sleep much. She nodded knowingly. Storms do that to a person. They stir up things we'd rather leave buried. His fingers tightened around the basket's handle. Was she talking about the weather or something more? Margaret sighed. Listen, I know you don't come around church anymore. And I'm not here to push you. But... She glanced at him, her voice lowering. Sam told me he saw you last night. Daniel stiffened. So? So he said you looked like you'd seen a ghost. His throat went dry. Margaret took a step closer. I've known you a long time, Daniel. I've seen what grief can do. I won't pretend to understand it, but I do know this. God's not done with you. The words hit like a hammer to his chest. Daniel forced a hollow chuckle. Funny. That's what the note said. Margaret's brow furrowed. What note? His stomach twisted. Sam hadn't told her. Then how did she know? The weight of silence pressed between them, thick and heavy. Margaret finally sighed and patted his arm. Come by the pantry if you need anything. And with that, she turned and walked back down the path, her boots crunching in the snow. Daniel stood there long after she left, the basket growing heavy in his hands. The whisper, the note, and now this. Something was happening, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, the untouched basket of food beside him. The silence in the cabin was different today, charged, expectant. He ran his fingers over the worn wooden surface, his thoughts tangled. Margaret's words lingered. God's not done with you, he scoffed under his breath. That's what they always say, isn't it? He had believed it once, clung to it like a lifeline. But that was before the accident, before the prayers that went unanswered. Before the silence stretched so long, he stopped listening altogether. And yet, I am with you. The whisper had felt so real, more real than anything had in years. He exhaled sharply and reached for the small note Sam had given him. The paper was slightly crumpled from how tightly he had held it last night. The message was simple. He hasn't forgotten you. Daniel closed his eyes. Was it possible? Could God still be speaking after all this time? A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin's windows, breaking his thoughts. He turned toward the door, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand. The road leading into town was mostly cleared now, the snow already packed down by passing cars. Before he could change his mind, Daniel grabbed his coat. The town of Whitaker's Hollow was small, the Sioux, kind of place where everyone knew each other's business. Daniel had spent years avoiding it, only making the occasional trip for necessities. As he stepped onto the main street, he could feel the stares. People whispered, glancing at him like he was some ghost from the past. The Copper Kettle Diner sat at the corner, its neon sign flickering weakly against the morning light. He hesitated before stepping inside. The warmth hit him instantly, carrying the scent of coffee and fresh bread. A few heads turned. Conversations quieted. Daniel ignored them and found an empty stool at the counter. A familiar voice spoke. "Well, if it isn't Daniel Whitaker." He glanced up. Grace Holloway. She stood behind the counter, an apron tied around her waist. Her dark curls were pulled back, but a few loose strands framed her face. She looked at him with a mix of surprise and something else, concern maybe? "Didn't expect to see you here," she said, setting a coffee cup in front of him. "Figured you'd given up on civilization." "Not yet," he murmured. She leaned on the counter, studying him. "Margaret told me she stopped by." Daniel huffed. "Of course she did," Grace smirked. "You know her. She thinks everyone's her personal mission." He took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle him. "Yeah." A pause, then softer. "She's not wrong, you know." Daniel frowned. "About what?" Grace tilted her head. "That God's not done with you." Something tightened in his chest. "You sound just like her." "Maybe that's not a bad thing." Daniel wanted to argue, to dismiss it. But before he could, the diner door swung open, and a gust of cold air rushed in. Sam stood in the entrance, eyes wide when he saw Daniel. "You're here," the boy said, almost in awe. Daniel's heart pounded. Why did it feel like that meant something? Daniel shifted uncomfortably under Sam's gaze. The boy's awe unsettled him. It wasn't admiration. It was something deeper, something searching. I just needed some coffee," Daniel muttered, staring into his cup. Sam didn't move. He glanced at Grace, as if asking permission to speak. She gave him a small nod. Finally, Sam took a hesitant step forward. "I prayed you'd come." Daniel stiffened. His grip on the cup tightened. "What?" Sam pulled something from his pocket. Small leather-bound Bible, its edges worn and frayed. He placed it on the counter in front of Daniel. "This was my dad's," he said quietly. Daniel looked at it but didn't touch it. He didn't want to. He didn't need another reminder of faith, another weight pressing against him. "I don't know why, but I think you're supposed to have it," Sam continued. His voice was steady but held a raw sincerity that made it hard for Daniel to dismiss him. Grace watched in silence, her expression unreadable. Daniel swallowed. "Kid, I don't—" The door jingled again, interrupting him. This time it was Margaret. Her sharp eyes swept over the room, landing on Daniel and the Bible between them. She exhaled, something like relief in her face. "So, you made it into town after all." Daniel forced a smirk. "Guess you were right. I couldn't stay hidden forever." Margaret sat beside him. "No, you couldn't. And maybe it's time you stopped trying." Daniel exhaled heavily. "You and Grace are really doubling down on this whole God's not done with you thing." Margaret smiled. "That's because we believe it." He shook his head, pushing the Bible back toward Sam. I'm not the person you think I am. Sam's brows furrowed. Then who are you? The question hit harder than it should have. For a long time, Daniel had known exactly who he was. A pastor, a man of faith, a servant of God. But after the accident, he had become something else. A man carrying guilt, anger, and silence. And now? I don't know anymore, he admitted. Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. Then maybe it's time you find out. Daniel met her gaze, searching for any sign that she was just saying what he wanted to hear. But there was no empty reassurance, no forced hope, only truth. The Bible still sat there, waiting. Sam didn't take it back. Outside, the wind howled, whispering through the cracks of the old diner. And for the first time in years, Daniel wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in the silence after all. The Bible sat on the counter between them, its presence heavier than its weight. Daniel kept his hands firmly wrapped around his coffee cup, resisting the urge to touch it. It was just a book, ink on paper, wasn't it? Grace cleared her throat. Margaret's right, you know. Running won't change what happened. Daniel huffed a bitter laugh. You think I don't know that? He rubbed his temple, exhaustion settling into his bones. I've been running so long, I don't even know what I'm running from anymore. Sam shifted beside him. Maybe you're running from yourself. Daniel looked at the boy, startled by the bluntness. There was no judgment in Sam's face, only an earnestness that unsettled him more than any accusation would have. Before he could respond, Margaret spoke. You know, this town remembers you, Daniel. People still talk about the way you used to preach, the way you cared. He clenched his jaw. Yeah? Then they also remember how I left. Silence stretched between them. Margaret and Grace exchanged glances, but it was Sam who spoke first. Why did you leave? Daniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. I lost someone, he said finally, and I lost everything after that. The words tasted bitter. He hadn't spoken them aloud in years. Sam studied him carefully. You lost God? Daniel scoffed, running a hand through his hair. Something like that. Sam was quiet for a moment before he slid the Bible closer. Maybe he never lost you. The word struck a nerve, and Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He looked at the boy. So sure, so certain. He used to be like that. He used to believe with that kind of conviction. Grace gave him a gentle smile. Just stay a little longer, Daniel. At least for tonight. Daniel hesitated. The diner was warm, the company strangely comforting. Outside, the night stretched on, dark and cold. He sighed, nodding. Yeah, okay. Margaret's expression softened. Good. That's a start. As the wind rattled the windows, Daniel Whitaker sat in the glow of the diner lights, wondering if, against all odds, God was whispering through the silence after all. The old church bell rang in the distance, its sound barely audible over the howling wind. Rain lashed against the diner windows, streaming down in rivulets as thunder rumbled overhead. Daniel watched the storm, feeling an eerie sense of familiarity settle over him. It was on a night like this, years ago, when everything had changed. Looks like it's going to be a bad one, Margaret murmured, peering out the window. Storms don't usually hit this hard this time of year. Grace glanced at Daniel. You all right? He forced a tight smile. Just tired. It wasn't a lie. The weight of the past, the memories clawing at the edges of his mind, drained him more than he cared to admit. He should have left town already. Staying the night had been a mistake. But something was keeping him here. Sam sat across from him, flipping through the Bible he had pushed toward Daniel earlier. He hadn't opened it, but its presence nagged at him. "Do you ever feel like God speaks to you?" Sam asked suddenly, looking up. Daniel stiffened. "What?" Sam shrugged. "Like, not out loud, but in ways you don't expect. Little things, like a thought that won't leave your mind, or a feeling that you're supposed to do something, even when it doesn't make sense." Daniel stared at him. "I think he does that a lot," Sam continued, tapping his fingers against the Bible's cover. "Whispers, but most people aren't listening." A cold shiver ran down Daniel's spine. The wind outside shrieked, rattling the diner's door. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the whole room plunged into darkness. A gasp came from one of the booths, followed by Margaret's, voice calm and steady. "Power lines must be down." A few seconds later, the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the diner in a dim glow. Outside, the storm raged on. Daniel rubbed his arms, suddenly chilled. The darkness, the storm, it felt too familiar. Too much like the night he had lost her. Then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, he heard it. A whisper. Not from anyone in the diner. Not from the wind. "Go." Daniel's breath caught. He spun toward the door, his heart hammering. The storm outside remained unchanged, but something in his chest shifted. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But he knew one thing with certainty. He needed to go, now. Daniel hesitated only for a moment. The whisper had been unmistakable. Urgent. Go. He grabbed his jacket, ignoring the questioning looks from Grace and Sam. The storm outside was brutal, but whatever was pulling him forward was stronger than the fear pressing against his ribs. "You're not seriously thinking about going out in that, are you?" Grace asked, her eyes filled with concern. "I have to," Daniel said simply. Margaret folded her arms. "It's dangerous, Daniel. Roads might be flooded." He met her gaze. "I know. That was the problem." He knew. This wasn't rational. It wasn't logical. But he also knew he couldn't ignore it. The same voice that had whispered to him in the middle of the night was calling again, and this time, something inside him wouldn't let him resist. "Where are you even going?" Sam asked. Daniel didn't have an answer, but he turned and pushed open the diner door anyway, stepping into the storm. The wind howled as he made his way to his car. Rain pounded against him, soaking through his jacket in seconds. He slid into the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, pulse racing. Where? He had no destination, no plan. But then, a flicker of memory, not his own, flashed through his mind. A winding road, a pair of headlights cutting through the rain. A car swerving. Daniel inhaled sharply. This wasn't just about him. With shaking hands, he started the engine. The tires skidded slightly as he pulled out onto the wet pavement, but he didn't hesitate. The whisper had told him to go, so he went. The road was nearly invisible under the sheets of rain. His headlights barely cut through the storm. Trees lined both sides of the narrow highway, their branches whipping wildly. Then, up ahead, taillights. A car was stalled at the edge of the road, hazard lights blinking weakly. Panic rose in Daniel's chest. The vision he'd had moments ago sent a warning through his veins. He pulled over, his heart hammering. A woman sat in the driver's seat, her face pale and her hands gripping the steering wheel. A young boy sat beside her, eyes wide with fear. Daniel rushed to the window and knocked. The woman turned, relief washing over her face. "My car won't start," she called through the glass. "My phone has no signal. I didn't know what to do." Daniel glanced at the boy. The child's small hands clutched a stuffed bear, his lip trembling. Lightning flashed. The road ahead was a sharp curve. If anyone came speeding around it, Daniel swallowed hard. "Come on," he said. "Get in my car. Now." The woman hesitated, but something in his voice must have convinced her. She grabbed her son and hurried out of the car. Seconds after they got into Daniel's vehicle, a set of headlights appeared in the distance. A truck barreling too fast down the slick road. Daniel barely had time to process what was happening. The out-of-control truck skidded, hydroplaned, and smashed directly into the woman's abandoned car. Metal crunched, glass shattered. The impact sent debris flying across the road. The woman gasped, clutching her son. "Oh my God." Daniel exhaled, hands tight on the steering wheel. He had heard the whisper, and because of it, 2 lives had been saved. The wrecked car smoldered in the rain, steam rising into the stormy night. The massive truck, its front end crushed, had come to a halt just inches from where the woman and her son had been sitting moments before. Daniel's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. His pulse thundered in his ears. If he had hesitated, if he had ignored the whisper, 2 lives would have been lost. The woman beside him was sobbing, clutching her son. "I don't understand," she whispered. "How did you know?" Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. How did he know? How could he explain the whisper, the vision of this exact moment flashing through his mind before it happened? Instead, he swallowed and said, "Are you both okay?" The boy nodded, eyes wide. The woman wiped at her face, looking from the wreck to Daniel. "I think so, but that man..." She pointed toward the truck. Daniel's breath caught. The driver, he pushed the door open, rain pelting him as he sprinted toward the crumpled semi. The front cab was twisted, the windshield cracked, but the driver was still inside, moving. Daniel yanked the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The driver, a burly man in his 40s, blood trickling from his forehead, groaned and fumbled with his seatbelt. "Hey, can you move?" Daniel called. The man blinked at him, dazed. I think so." Daniel braced himself against the wet metal and yanked the door with all his strength. It gave way with a screech, and the driver tumbled, out, staggering on unsteady legs. "I didn't see the car," he mumbled. "The rain. It was too fast." Daniel nodded grimly. "You could have killed them." The driver's face paled as he spotted the woman and child still huddled in Daniel's car. He let out a shuddering breath, running a trembling hand through his wet hair. "I swear I wasn't drinking. I lost control." Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You need to sit down. You might have a concussion." The man sank onto the wet pavement as sirens finally pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the darkness, and Daniel exhaled. Help was here. Yet something inside him felt unfinished. As paramedics rushed to check on the driver, and a police officer hurried toward the woman, Daniel turned away, staring into the storm. His breath was unsteady. He had listened to the whisper, and it had saved them. But what did that mean for him? Had God really been speaking to him all along? Or was he just losing his mind? The wind howled, rattling the trees, and somewhere in that, emptiness. In the silence that followed the chaos, Daniel thought he heard it again. "Keep going." His heart pounded, and for the first time in years, he whispered back. "Where?" The rain had eased to a drizzle, but Daniel barely noticed. The wreckage, the flashing lights, the murmurs of the officers, it all blurred together. His focus was locked on the whisper that had spoken into his soul. "Keep going." Where? To what? The woman and her son were speaking with the paramedics now, still shaken but unharmed. The truck driver sat on the curb, head bowed, hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. Daniel swallowed. A month ago, he would have dismissed it all, chalked up the voice to exhaustion or stress. But tonight, Tonight was different. He had followed the whisper, and it had saved lives. He took a deep breath and turned back toward his car. He needed to leave before anyone asked too many questions, before someone tried to make sense of what he couldn't even explain to himself. As he opened the door, a hand caught his arm. Wait, it was the woman. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling. You never answered me back there. How did you know? How did you know to get us out? Daniel hesitated. The truth hovered on his tongue, but it felt too big to say aloud. He barely understood it himself. I just knew, he finally said. Her gaze searched his face. Was it God? The question hit harder than he expected. He had spent years running from God, resenting him, doubting his goodness. And now, here he was, faced with the undeniable weight of something he couldn't explain. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe. The woman's lips parted as if she wanted to say more, but instead, she just nodded. Well, thank you. Daniel gave a stiff nod and slid into the driver's seat. The moment the door shut, he exhaled heavily. His pulse was still uneven, his thoughts tangled. He turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, but he didn't drive off immediately. Keep going. The whisper echoed in his chest, insistent. With a sigh, he pulled onto the road. He didn't have a destination. He didn't even know what he was looking for. But for the first time in years, he was willing to listen. The hum of the tires on the wet pavement was the only sound accompanying Daniel as he drove through the quiet streets. He had no destination, only the lingering weight of the whisper pressing against his heart. Keep going. But where? His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. He was a man who once had certainty, who had preached with conviction and walked with purpose. Now he was a wanderer, lost in the wreckage of his own past. He turned onto a dimly lit road leading out of town. Maybe he was running again. Maybe he was searching. He wasn't sure which anymore. A neon sign flickered ahead. A roadside diner, the kind that stayed open all night. Without thinking, he pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine. The place was nearly empty, save for a lone waitress and a few scattered patrons. Daniel stepped inside, the warmth of coffee and fried food wrapping around him. He chose a booth in the corner, away from the windows, and rubbed his hands together, trying to shake the cold that clung to his skin. A waitress approached, her name tag reading Maggie. She was in her 60s, with tired eyes but a kind smile. What can I get you, hun? Just coffee, he said. She nodded and disappeared behind the counter. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. Why am I here? As if in response, the door jingled open. A young man stumbled in, barely more than a teenager, his hoodie soaked from the rain. He kept his head down as he slid into a booth near the entrance, rubbing his hands over his face. Daniel wasn't sure why he noticed the kid. Maybe it was the way his shoulders shook slightly, as if he was holding back something heavy. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing toward the door, like he expected someone to barge in after him. Maggie approached the boy, setting a cup of coffee in front of him without a word. The kid looked up, surprised, and she simply patted his shoulder, before walking away. Daniel turned back to his own coffee, telling himself it wasn't his concern. But the whisper returned. Talk to him. Daniel frowned. No. The whisper pressed again, gentle but firm. Talk to him. He sighed, shaking his head. It had been years since he had tried to help someone, and what good had it ever done? He had lost everything, lost his faith, lost. The boy sniffed, wiping his sleeve across his face. Daniel clenched his jaw. Fine. He pushed himself up and walked toward the booth, his heart hammering. "Hey," he said, standing at the edge of the table. "You okay?" The boy stiffened, his eyes wary. "I'm fine." Daniel hesitated. "You sure? You look like you could use someone to talk to." The kid scoffed. "And who are you? Some kind of pastor?" Daniel flinched at the irony. "Not anymore." The boy stared at him for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. "Good, 'cause I don't need a sermon." He looked down, his voice quieter. "I just need a way out." Daniel swallowed hard. Maybe, just maybe, the whisper had led him here for a reason. Daniel hesitated, standing at the edge of the booth. The kid? No, the young man. Kept his head down, fingers wrapped around the coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping him steady. "I just need a way out." Daniel's chest tightened. How many times had he whispered the same thing in the quiet hours of the night? How many times had he wanted to escape his own pain, his own failures? "Mind if I sit?" Daniel asked. The young man shrugged, not looking up. Daniel slid into the booth across from him. They sat in silence for a while, the rain tapping against the diner windows. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a dim glow over the empty tables. Finally, Daniel spoke. "What's your name?" The boy exhaled sharply, as if debating whether to answer. "Ethan." Daniel nodded. "All right, Ethan. You got someplace to go?" A bitter laugh escaped Ethan's lips. "If I did, I wouldn't be here." Daniel took a sip of his coffee, weighing his words carefully. He had no answers, no solutions, just a nudge in his spirit that told him to be here, to listen. "I know what it's like," Daniel said finally, feeling like there's nowhere left to turn. Ethan scoffed. "Yeah? What happened to you?" Daniel hesitated. He had spent years avoiding that question, pushing it deep into the shadows. But looking at Ethan now, his hollow eyes, his slumped shoulders, Daniel knew the boy didn't need a polished answer. He needed truth. "I lost someone," Daniel admitted. "And I blamed God for it. So I ran." Ethan studied him for a moment. "Did running help?" Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "Not really." Silence stretched between them. After a moment, Ethan sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "My dad kicked me out," he muttered. "Said he was done with me. I guess I don't blame him." Daniel frowned. Why would he do that? Ethan shook his head. "I messed up." His voice was raw, laced with regret. "Got into some trouble. Made some bad choices. Now I got nowhere to go." He swallowed hard. "I tried calling my mom, but she won't pick up." Daniel could see the battle happening behind Ethan's eyes, the guilt, the hurt, the desperation. He had seen it before, in the mirror, on nights when he had begged for something, anything, to make the pain stop. "I don't know if this means anything to you," Daniel said slowly. "But you're not alone." Ethan huffed, looking away. "That's what people say when they don't know what else to say." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, maybe. But it's still true." Ethan didn't respond. Daniel glanced out the window. The rain had softened to a drizzle, mist rising from the pavement. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know why he was here, why the whisper had led him to this moment. But he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away. "You need a place to stay?" Daniel asked. Ethan's eyes flicked to his. "Why do you care?" Daniel considered the question. He could say it was because of the whisper, because of something stirring inside him. But in the end, it was simpler than that. "Because someone once told me to keep going," Daniel said. "And maybe that's what I'm supposed to tell you." Ethan stared at him for a long moment. Then, finally, he exhaled and gave a small nod. "All right," he said. Daniel nodded back. Maybe, just maybe, this was the road back, for both of them. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle as Daniel and Ethan stepped out of the diner. The neon sign flickered above them, casting a faint glow onto the wet pavement. Daniel shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, glancing over at the young man beside him. Ethan was tense, his arms wrapped around himself like he was bracing for a blow that hadn't come yet. "You got a bag or anything?" Daniel asked. Ethan shook his head. "Nah, just me." Daniel nodded. He didn't press further. He knew what it was like to walk away from everything with nothing but the weight of regret pressing down on you. They started walking toward Daniel's truck, parked at the far end of the lot. The silence between them was heavy, but Daniel didn't mind. He had learned that sometimes silence was better than empty words. As they reached the truck, Ethan hesitated. "You sure about this?" Daniel met his gaze. "Yeah." Ethan looked away, shuffling his feet. "I don't need charity." "This isn't charity," Daniel said. "It's just a place to rest." Ethan's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight in him dimming just a little. After a long pause, he nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. Daniel slid behind the wheel and started the engine. The heater hummed to life, filling the cabin with warmth. They drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. Daniel glanced over occasionally, noticing the way Ethan kept shifting uncomfortably, like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "You ever been to church?" Daniel asked suddenly. Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, when I was a kid. My mom used to drag me every Sunday." His expression darkened. "Guess that didn't stick." Daniel tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. "Yeah, I get that." Ethan gave him a sideways glance. "You a pastor or something?" Daniel stiffened, gripping the wheel a little tighter. He exhaled, shaking his head. "I used to be." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Used to be." Daniel sighed. He hadn't meant to open that door, but there was no taking it back now. "I walked away. After some things happened." Ethan didn't press, but Daniel could tell he wanted to. Instead, the younger man looked out the window, watching the raindrops streak across the glass. After a few minutes, he spoke. "You think God actually cares? Like about people like me?" Daniel swallowed hard. It was the same question that had haunted him for years. "I think..." He hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I think he doesn't give up on us, even when we give up on him." Ethan scoffed, but didn't argue. The truck rumbled down the road, the rain now nothing more than a mist in the air. Daniel didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he could help Ethan, or if he even had the strength to try. But, for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir in his chest. A whisper. A step. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to start walking again. The night had deepened by the time Daniel pulled into the driveway of his small, weathered house. The porch light flickered dimly, casting long shadows over the damp grass. Ethan sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his fingers tapping anxiously against his leg. "This is it," Daniel said, shutting off the engine. Ethan glanced at the modest house, then back at Daniel. "You live alone?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "You sure it's okay for me to stay?" "I wouldn't have offered if it wasn't." A beat of silence passed before Ethan let out a sigh and pushed open the door. As they stepped inside, the scent of old wood and coffee filled the air. The living room was simple. Well-worn furniture, a bookshelf lined with theology and mystery novels, and a small cross still hanging on the wall, though covered in dust. Daniel tossed his keys on the table. "It's not much, but it's warm." Ethan lingered near the doorway, eyes scanning the room as if expecting something to jump out at him. "You can take the couch," Daniel offered. "Bathroom's down the hall. There's some blankets in the closet." Ethan nodded but didn't move. His hands fidgeted at his sides. Daniel studied him for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to explain anything, Ethan. Not unless you want to." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "That's a first." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Every other place I've crashed, people wanted to know my story first. Make sure I was worth it." Daniel exhaled through his nose, his expression softening. "We're all broken, Ethan. No one gets to decide who's worth helping." Ethan looked down, his jaw tight. Then, with a reluctant nod, he walked over to the couch and sat down. Daniel moved toward the kitchen. "You hungry?" "Nah," Ethan muttered. "You sure?" A pause, then a quiet, "Yeah." Daniel didn't push. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee, the warmth grounding him. As he leaned against the counter, he found his eyes drawn to the dusty cross on the wall. He hadn't taken it down. He didn't know why. For a long time, it had just been another piece of the past, a relic of a life he no longer lived. But tonight, with a lost young man sleeping on his couch and a whisper of something stirring in his heart, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the cross wasn't just decoration. It was a reminder. A door was opening, even if he wasn't sure where it led. And for the first time in years, Daniel wondered if he had the courage to step through it. Daniel awoke before dawn, the house still wrapped in silence. For a moment, he remained on the edge of sleep, staring at the ceiling, his mind thick with memories. The whisper that had haunted him for weeks was absent, yet its presence lingered. In the quiet of the morning, he pushed himself up and walked into the living room. Ethan was curled up on the couch, his thin frame hidden beneath a blanket. His breathing was steady, but his brow furrowed in sleep. Whatever roads had led him here, they had not been kind. Daniel exhaled and stepped into the kitchen. He filled the coffee maker and let the aroma of brewing coffee pull him fully into the day. As he poured himself a cup, he heard a shuffle behind him. Ethan stood in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Morning," he mumbled. "Morning," Daniel replied, sliding a mug across the counter. Ethan hesitated before picking it up. He took a sip and winced. "Strong," Daniel smirked. "Helps wake you up." Ethan leaned against the counter, silent for a moment. I appreciate this, letting me stay." "You don't have to thank me," Daniel said. "You needed a place. That's enough." Ethan nodded but didn't respond. Instead, he studied the small kitchen, the worn countertops, the mismatched plates stacked by the sink, the unopened Bible resting near the window. "You used to be a pastor, right?" Daniel stiffened. He hadn't expected that question, at least not so soon. "Yeah," he admitted. "What happened?" Daniel swallowed. The memories pressed in. The accident, the funeral, the silence that followed. "I lost someone," he said finally. "And I lost my faith along with them." Ethan nodded slowly, as if he understood. "I lost someone too," he murmured. Daniel looked at him. "Your parents?" Ethan let out a bitter chuckle. "Might as well have. My mom left when I was a kid. My dad..." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "We don't talk." Daniel wanted to ask more, but he could see the wall going up in Ethan's eyes. He recognized that kind of pain, the kind you carry alone because trusting someone with it feels impossible. Instead, he took another sip of coffee and let the silence settle between them. Finally, Ethan spoke. "So, what now?" Daniel exhaled. "I don't know." Ethan gave a small nod. "Me neither." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Two lost souls, standing in the quiet of a house that wasn't really a home. Then, Somewhere deep within Daniel's heart, something stirred. Maybe they didn't need to know what came next. Maybe they just needed to take the next step. The morning passed in an uneasy stillness, neither Daniel nor Ethan saying much. The weight of unspoken wounds lingered between them, but Daniel had learned that some silences weren't meant to be filled. After breakfast, nothing more than toast and coffee. Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the frost-covered grass. "I should probably go," he muttered. Daniel set his mug down, watching the boy carefully. "Where would you go?" Ethan shrugged. "Back to the street, I guess." Something inside Daniel clenched. He had spent years ignoring the pull to help, convincing himself that his own pain was too great to carry anyone else's. But Ethan was right here, right now. And maybe this was the whisper's purpose, to lead him to moments like this. "You don't have to leave," Daniel said. Ethan turned to him, skepticism in his eyes. "Why are you helping me?" Daniel hesitated, then answered honestly, "Because I know what it's like to be lost." Ethan didn't reply, but something in his expression softened. He didn't argue. He didn't run. That was enough for now. After a pause, Daniel asked, "Have you ever worked before?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Depends. You mean real work or just surviving?" Daniel smirked. "Real work, earning money the right way." Ethan exhaled. "Not really. I used to help out at a mechanic's shop when I was a kid, but nothing steady." Daniel nodded. He thought of his friend Mike, who owned a small hardware store in town. Mike was a gruff man with a good heart, and Daniel had seen him give second chances to people who didn't deserve them. Maybe he'd be willing to do the same for Ethan. "I might know someone who can give you a job," Daniel said. "Nothing fancy, but it's better than the street." Ethan studied him. "You don't even know me." "I don't have to," Daniel replied. "I just know you deserve a chance." Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "People don't just help others for no reason." Daniel thought of the whisper, of the moments that had led him here. Sometimes they do. A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, Ethan gave a small, reluctant nod. "All right," he said. "I'll give it a shot." Daniel exhaled, a strange sense of relief washing over him, one step forward. Maybe that was how redemption began. Daniel parked his truck in front of Miller's Hardware, the small-town shop owned by his old friend, Mike Miller. The wooden sign above the door was worn, but sturdy, much like the man himself. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, his fingers drumming, restlessly on his knee. "This guy, he actually knows I'm coming?" Daniel smirked. "Not exactly, but Mike's got a soft spot for helping people who need a break." Ethan scoffed. "Sounds like a saint." Daniel shook his head. "Not quite. He'll make you work for it." Ethan didn't reply, but his jaw tightened as he looked at the storefront. Daniel recognized that look. Hesitation, the kind that came from years of expecting rejection. Daniel reached for the door handle. "Come on." Inside, the scent of sawdust and oil filled the air. Wooden shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from nails to power tools. At the counter, a burly man with graying hair and a flannel shirt was sorting through inventory. Mike glanced up. "Well, I'll be, if it isn't Daniel Whitaker." Daniel smiled. "Good to see you, Mike." Mike leaned on the counter. "Last time you came in here, you bought a hammer and looked like you were debating using it on yourself." Daniel chuckled. "Had some rough days." "Haven't we all?" Mike's gaze shifted to Ethan, scanning him with a sharp eye. "And who's this?" Ethan straightened slightly, his guard back up. "This is Ethan," Daniel said. "He's looking for work. Thought you might have something for him." Mike arched an eyebrow. "You vouch for him?" Daniel hesitated for only a second. Yeah, I do. Mike folded his arms. You got any experience, kid? Ethan shifted. Not much, but I'm a quick learner. Mike exhaled. I don't do charity. If you work here, you show up on time, do the job right, and don't expect handouts. Ethan nodded. I don't need handouts. Mike held his gaze for a long moment, then finally grunted. All right. Trial run. 3 days. If you slack off, you're out. Ethan blinked, as if surprised it had been that easy. Okay. Yeah, I can do that. Mike extended a calloused hand. Ethan hesitated, then shook it. Be here at 7 sharp tomorrow, Mike said. And don't make me regret this. Ethan swallowed. I won't. As they walked back to the truck, Daniel glanced at Ethan. You all right? Ethan shrugged, but there was something unreadable in his expression. No one's ever trusted me that fast before. Daniel smiled. Maybe it's time someone did. Ethan exhaled. Guess we'll see if I deserve it. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he heard it again. The whisper, gentle yet firm. Trust is planted before it grows. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Daniel found himself wondering if this moment wasn't just about Ethan's redemption, maybe it was about his own. The early morning light stretched over the town as Daniel sipped his coffee, watching Ethan head into Miller's Hardware for his first day. The young man's shoulders were tense, his steps hesitant but determined. Daniel prayed silently, asking God to guide him. It still felt strange. Prayer. The words didn't always come easily, and when they did, they felt clumsy, uncertain. Like a man trying to remember a song he hadn't sung in years. As he drove away, the whisper returned, as soft as a breeze through autumn leaves. Unfinished prayers are still heard. Daniel swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel. He had plenty of unfinished prayers, ones he'd abandoned, ones that had turned into anger and silence. Could God still hear those? His truck rumbled down Main Street until he found himself in front of Hope Community Church. He hadn't meant to come here, but somehow he had. The small church sat nestled between oak trees, its white steeple standing against the sky. Daniel hadn't stepped inside since he'd left the pulpit, since he'd walked away from the life he thought was his calling. The front doors were open. He hesitated, but something, or someone, nudged him forward. Inside, the scent of old wood and hymnals greeted him. The sanctuary was empty except for one person, Pastor Tom Riley. Tom looked up from the altar, where he was adjusting the floral arrangements. His face lit up with surprise. Well, I'll be Daniel Whitaker. Daniel forced a smile. Morning, Tom. Tom set down a vase and walked over, extending his hand. Been a while. Daniel shook it. Yeah, it has. Tom studied him with knowing eyes. What brings you here? Daniel exhaled, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. Honestly, I don't know. Tom nodded as if he understood something Daniel didn't. Well, since you're here, want to sit for a bit? Daniel hesitated, then followed Tom to one of the pews. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Tom said quietly, I used to think prayers needed to be polished to be heard, that I had to have the right words. He glanced at Daniel. You ever feel that way? Daniel let out a dry chuckle. All the time. Tom nodded. But I've learned something over the years. God hears the prayers we can't finish, the ones we give up on, the ones we whisper in anger or doubt. Daniel looked down at his hands. Even the ones that never made it past silence? Tom's voice was gentle. Especially those. Daniel swallowed against the lump in his throat. The whisper returned, clear and steady. It's time. His heart pounded. Time for what? He didn't know yet. But as he sat in the pew of the church he once called home, he realized he wasn't just visiting. He was being called back. Daniel sat in the pew long after Tom had gone back to his work at the altar. The whisper still lingered in his mind. It's time. Time for what? To return to preaching? To stand before a congregation again? The thought made his stomach tighten. No, he wasn't ready. He rubbed his face and exhaled. His faith was still fragile. His past still a wound barely stitched together. How could he guide others when he was still so uncertain himself? He was about to leave when he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Mr. Whitaker? He turned to see a woman standing a few feet away. She was in her early 30s, her dark brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Her eyes were tired, but kind. "I'm sorry," she said. "I saw you come in and, well, I wasn't sure if I should say something." Daniel stood. "Do we know each other?" She nodded hesitantly. "You probably don't remember me. I used to come to your church a long time ago." Daniel studied her face. There was something familiar but distant. "I'm Claire," she continued. "Claire Peterson." The name triggered something deep in his memory, but before he could grasp it, she looked away, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "I just wanted to say, I'm glad you're here." Daniel wasn't sure how to respond. "Thank you," she hesitated, then added, "People still talk about you, you know, about how much you helped them, even after you left." Daniel's throat tightened. He hadn't expected that. He'd assumed his absence had left more harm than good. Claire gave a small, uncertain smile. "I just thought you should know." She turned to go, but Daniel found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "Claire, how are you?" She froze for a second, then turned back. Her eyes flickered with something unspoken. She hesitated. "I'm getting by." Daniel could hear the weight in her voice. He knew that tone. The voice of someone carrying burdens they weren't sure they could keep holding. She gave him a polite nod. "It was good to see you again." And then she was gone, slipping out the church doors as quickly as she had appeared. Daniel stood there, staring after her, his heart unsettled. The whisper came again, softer this time. "You are not here by accident." Daniel closed his eyes. He wasn't sure if he believed that yet, but something told him. Maybe he would soon. The next morning, Daniel found himself walking through town with Claire's words still lingering in his mind. "I'm getting by." He had recognized the weight behind those words because he had once spoken them himself, when people asked how he was after the accident. The truth was, getting by wasn't the same as living. He sipped his coffee as he passed the town's small bookstore. The bell jingled as someone exited, and to his surprise, it was Claire. She looked up, startled to see him. "Oh, hi." "Morning," he said, offering a small smile. She shifted the paper bag in her arms, clearly unsure of what to say. He took a breath, then asked, "Would you like to sit for a bit?" He gestured to the benches near the sidewalk. "Just to talk." Claire hesitated, but then nodded. "Yeah, okay." They sat in silence for a moment before she finally spoke. "I wasn't sure you'd stay," she admitted, staring down at the coffee cup in her hands. Daniel glanced at her. "Honestly, I wasn't sure either." A small smile tugged at her lips, but it faded just as quickly. She exhaled. "It's strange seeing you here again. It reminds me of when I was a teenager, sitting in the back of your church, listening to you preach." Daniel shifted, unsure how to respond. "You once said something that stuck with me," Claire continued. "You said, 'God doesn't always take away the storms, but he never leaves us in them alone.'" Daniel frowned. He had said those words countless times. But did he still believe them? Claire let out a bitter laugh. I used to hold on to that. But lately, I don't know. He studied her carefully. Claire, what's going on? She hesitated, gripping her coffee cup tighter. My husband, Mark, he left. Her voice was flat, emotionless. But Daniel saw the pain behind it. Just walked away. Took his things and left me and Liam, our son. Daniel felt a familiar ache in his chest. The pain of abandonment. I keep asking myself what I did wrong, she whispered. Why God let it happen. Daniel took a slow breath. He wished he had the perfect answer. He wished he could give her some divine reason why suffering made sense, but he knew firsthand that sometimes it didn't. Claire. He hesitated. I don't know why things happen the way they do. I've asked the same questions. But I do know this. God hasn't left you. She looked at him, searching his face. Do you really believe that? Daniel swallowed. Did he? The whisper came then, quiet but steady. Tell her. He met her eyes. I'm starting to. A single tear slid down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. I want to believe that too. Daniel nodded. Maybe we can figure it out together. Claire gave him a watery smile. Yeah, maybe. As they sat in the morning light, Daniel realized something. This, right here, was why he had stayed. That evening, Daniel sat on his porch, staring at the sky as the last traces of daylight faded into darkness. His conversation with Claire lingered in his mind. Her pain was raw, deep, just like his had been, just like his still was. God hasn't left you. He had spoken those words to her, but had he truly meant them? He wanted to believe. He wanted to grasp onto that hope, but the weight of his past still clung to him like an iron chain. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the faint sound of crickets and the occasional passing car. It was a quiet town, the kind where you could hear your own thoughts a little too clearly. Then came the whisper. You're not alone. Daniel inhaled sharply, his heart pounding. He had heard it before, gentle yet firm, like a voice cutting through the fog of his doubts. He closed his eyes. God, if you're really there, I need to know. I need more than a whisper. I need something. Silence. A minute passed, then another, and then the sound of footsteps. Daniel opened his eyes to see Claire walking up the porch steps, a hesitant look on her face. I hope I'm not bothering you, she said, hugging her arms. Not at all. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. Have a seat. She hesitated before settling in, letting out a slow breath. I wasn't sure where else to go. Daniel studied her carefully. The weight of exhaustion was visible on her face. Did something happen? Claire let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. Everything and nothing, I guess. Liam's asleep and I felt like I needed to talk to someone. Daniel nodded. I get that. She hesitated, then said, I went to church. Today. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. I hadn't been in a while, she admitted. I sat in the back, just like I used to. It felt strange, like I was watching something from a life I used to live. Daniel understood that feeling all too well. Claire looked down at her hands. I wanted to feel something, to hear something, but it was just quiet. Daniel exhaled, his own doubts creeping in. Sometimes it is. She looked at him then, really looked at him. Does it ever come back? He swallowed hard. I think so. The whisper stirred again, gentle and sure. Tell her what you know. Daniel met her gaze. I don't have all the answers, Claire. But I do know this. Faith isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a glimmer in the dark, a whisper when you least expect it. Claire bit her lip, her eyes glistening. I think I could live with a whisper. A faint smile touched Daniel's lips. Yeah, me too. For the first time in a long while, he felt something shift. Maybe it wasn't about waiting for God to shout. Maybe it was about learning to listen. The next morning, Daniel awoke with an odd sense of anticipation. The conversation with Claire had left something stirring inside him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't full-fledged hope, but it wasn't despair either. As he poured his coffee, the familiar weight of silence filled the house. There had been a time when this silence comforted him, when solitude felt like a shield. But lately, it felt different. Hollow. His mind wandered back to the whisper from the night before. You're not alone. He exhaled. Then why does it still feel like I am? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Sheriff Mason standing on his porch, hat in hand. Morning, Daniel. Mason. He stepped aside. Come on in. The sheriff entered, glancing around before settling into the worn armchair by the fireplace. Saw Claire and her boy at church yesterday. Daniel nodded. She mentioned it. Mason leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. She's trying, Daniel. But she's scared. Feels like she's standing at the edge of something and doesn't know if she can take the next step. Daniel frowned. And you think I can help? Mason studied him for a moment. I think you already are. Daniel scoffed, rubbing his temple. I'm not exactly the best person to guide someone back to faith, Mason. I don't know about that. The sheriff leaned back. Seems to me you know what it's like to be lost. And maybe that's exactly the kind of person Claire needs to talk to. Daniel looked down at his coffee, his grip tightening around the mug. He wanted to believe that was true, but the doubts still lingered. Mason stood, adjusting his belt. Just thought you should know. People see what you're doing, even when you don't. As he walked to the door, he paused. Oh, one more thing. Daniel looked up. There's been talk about the old chapel outside town. Lights turning on at night. A few folks claim they've heard voices. Daniel tensed. What kind of voices? Mason's expression darkened. Some say whispers. Others say crying. A chill crawled up Daniel's spine. Mason sighed. I don't put much stock in ghost stories, but I figured you'd want to know. Daniel forced a nod. Thanks, Mason. When the sheriff left, Daniel sat in the silence, his pulse quickening. The chapel. It had been abandoned for years, left to decay after the congregation dissolved. He hadn't set foot there since. He shook his head. He wasn't going to entertain rumors. And yet, deep down, he knew. The whisper wasn't finished with him yet. Night had settled over the town by the time Daniel found himself on the road leading to the old chapel. The headlights of his truck cut through the darkness, illuminating the overgrown path ahead. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as memories stirred. Memories of sermons preached, prayers whispered, and faith once unshaken. Now, the building stood in ruin, abandoned like the faith he had once carried so fiercely. He parked a few yards away, the engine rumbling before falling into silence. For a long moment, he simply sat there, staring at the skeletal remains of the place that had once been sacred. The wooden doors were cracked, the windows fogged with grime. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest sound, something like a whisper. Daniel exhaled sharply. It's just the wind. Still, something in his chest urged him forward. He grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. As he approached, the air felt heavier, like the space around him was pressing inward. He hesitated at the threshold, running his fingers over the worn wood of the doors before pushing them open. Inside, the chapel was as ruined as he expected. Pews sat in disarray, their wood splintered and aged. The pulpit stood, though barely, its edges chipped away by time. And above it, the large stained glass window was cracked but still intact, the image of Christ faintly illuminated by the moonlight outside. Then he heard it. A whisper. Not the wind this time. A voice. Daniel turned sharply, his flashlight sweeping across the empty room. His pulse pounded. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. But then he heard it again, closer this time. Help me. The word sent a chill through his bones. His breath caught as he slowly turned toward the sound. In the farthest corner of the chapel, where shadows pooled thickly, something moved. Who's there? His own voice felt foreign to him, hoarse and unsteady. Silence. He took a step forward, then another. His flashlight flickered, and then a figure lunged from the darkness. Daniel stumbled back, heart hammering as the shape rushed toward him, small, frantic, desperate. It wasn't a ghost. It was a child, a young boy, no older than 10, barefoot and trembling, eyes wide with terror. His clothes were torn, his face smudged with dirt. "Please," the boy gasped. "He's coming." Daniel barely had time to process the words before something outside shifted. A shadow moving along the broken window. And then the whisper returned. But this time it wasn't asking for help. It was warning him. Daniel's breath hitched as the whisper curled around him like a phantom wind. The boy clutched his arm with trembling fingers, his eyes darting toward the shattered window. He's coming. The words replayed in Daniel's mind, tightening his chest. He swallowed hard and knelt beside the child, trying to keep his voice steady. "Who's coming?" he asked. The boy's lips parted, but no sound came. His body shuddered, and his fingers dug deeper into Daniel's sleeve. Then, another noise. Soft thud outside, slow, measured, like footsteps pressing into damp earth. Daniel turned toward the sound, his grip tightening on the flashlight. He swept its beam toward the window, expecting, dreading, to see something. Someone. Nothing. Only the skeletal trees, their branches shifting in the wind. But the air in the chapel had changed. The stillness was unnatural, dense with something unseen. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The whisper returned. This time, unmistakable. "Daniel, leave." His stomach twisted. The voice was neither the boy's nor his own. It was something beyond him, something not bound by flesh or time. Then, a crash. The doors of the chapel shuddered as if struck by an unseen force. Dust rained down from the rafters. The boy whimpered, his small body pressing closer to Daniel. Daniel rose to his feet, instinctively placing himself between the child and whatever lurked beyond the door. He had no weapon, no plan, only faith, what little remained of it. He forced himself to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who's there?" Silence. Then another. Knock. Harder this time. A surge of something ancient and primal crawled up Daniel's spine. He didn't know whether it was fear or something deeper, a warning placed in his soul. The whisper came again, urgent now. "Take the child and go." Daniel hesitated only a second before grasping the boy's hand. The child looked up at him, eyes round with fear. "Come on," Daniel whispered. He pulled the boy toward the side entrance, his heart hammering with every step. Another crash sounded behind them, the doors groaning as if straining against an unseen force. They reached the exit. Daniel shoved the door open. Cold night air hit them like a slap. He barely glanced back as they sprinted into the darkness. The boy's breath came in ragged gasps, his feet stumbling against the uneven ground. But they ran until the chapel was nothing more than a shadow behind them. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whisper stopped. And in the stillness, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Something had been inside that chapel with them, and it had wanted the boy. Daniel didn't stop running until they reached the tree line. He pulled the boy behind a thick oak, pressing his back against the rough bark. His chest heaved, his pulse a frantic drum in his ears. Silence wrapped around them, but it was the wrong kind of silence, the kind that felt too heavy, too intentional. The boy trembled against him, his small hands clutching Daniel's coat. He wasn't crying, but his breaths were sharp and uneven, as if he were barely holding himself together. Daniel crouched down, gripping the child's shoulders. "Are you hurt?" The boy shook his head. His dark eyes flickered toward the chapel, still barely visible through the trees. "It wanted me." A chill crawled up Daniel's spine. "What did?" The boy hesitated. His fingers twitched against Daniel's sleeve as if weighing his words. Then, slowly, he pulled back his shirt sleeve. Daniel's stomach lurched. There, just above the boy's wrist, was a mark. Faint, but undeniable. A dark, swirling imprint, almost like a burn. But it wasn't random. It was deliberate, intricate, a symbol. Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't recognize it, but something in his spirit recoiled at the sight. How did this happen? His voice was barely above a whisper. The boy's gaze dropped. "It touched me." Daniel stiffened. "When?" "In the chapel. Before you came." The boy's voice was small, haunted. "I couldn't see it, but I felt it." Daniel exhaled shakily. He didn't doubt the boy's words, not after the whispers, not after the doors shook as if something had been trying to get in, or keep them from leaving. He glanced back toward the chapel, now a looming shadow beneath the moonlight. Then, movement. A flicker, just beyond the broken window. Daniel's stomach twisted. Something was still inside, watching, waiting. He turned back to the boy. "We need to go." The child nodded without hesitation. Daniel rose, scanning the darkness. They needed somewhere safe, somewhere far from whatever had touched the boy. But deep down, he knew the truth. They weren't running from something ordinary. This was a battle unseen, and the mark on the boy's skin meant it was far from over. Daniel gripped the boy's wrist gently, careful not to touch the mark. The eerie design still burned in his mind, as if it had been seared into his own skin. He knew symbols carried power. He'd seen it in scripture, in ancient stories of divine encounters. Some marks were blessings, others warnings. The night pressed against them, thick and oppressive. The trees swayed with an unseen breath, their skeletal branches twisting toward the sky. Daniel scanned the darkness. They couldn't stay here. "Come on," he whispered, pulling the boy along. They moved through the woods, their footsteps muffled by damp earth. Daniel's senses were sharpened, alert to every rustling leaf, every shift in the wind. The weight of the night pressed down on him, as if something unseen watched from the shadows. "Where are we going?" the boy whispered. "Somewhere safe." The words felt empty. Was anywhere safe from what had just happened? Then, a whisper, not from within him, but around him. Soft, indistinct, but real. Daniel stopped cold. The boy tensed beside him. "What is it?" Daniel strained his ears. The wind carried the whisper, distant yet near. It was more than a sound. It was a presence, a shift in the air, a deep, unseen pull. And then, a figure. Daniel's breath caught as a shape emerged from the shadows. Tall, still, watching. Moonlight touched the edges of a hooded form, standing just beyond the trees. Not moving, not speaking, just waiting. Daniel's pulse pounded. He took a step back, pushing the boy behind him. The figure lifted its head, and though its face remained hidden in shadow, Daniel felt its gaze. Heavy, knowing, ancient. Then, a voice, low and firm. "You should not have taken him." Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. He tightened his grip on the boy's hand and ran. Daniel's feet pounded against the forest floor, his breath coming in short gasps. The boy clung to his hand, struggling to keep up. The shadows stretched long in the moonlight, shifting unnaturally as if they had a will of their own. Behind them, the hooded figure did not give chase, but its presence pressed against Daniel's soul, heavy and unrelenting. "You should not have taken him." The words echoed in his mind, laced with something more than accusation, warning. "Daniel," the boy wheezed. Where are we going?" Daniel didn't know. He only knew they had to move. A branch snapped somewhere to their left. Then another. Not just one pursuer. Many. The unseen watchers closed in. Daniel yanked the boy down a slope, his boots slipping against the damp earth. They crashed through underbrush, twigs clawing at their skin. His lungs burned, his body protesting with every step. Then, a light. Golden. Flickering. Ahead, a cabin stood among the trees, its single window glowing with the warm pulse of a lantern. The sight sent a jolt of hope through Daniel's weary frame. He forced himself forward, his grip tightening on the boy's hand. Almost there. Then, a whisper. Not from behind them. From ahead. Daniel skidded to a stop just as the door to the cabin creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the lantern's glow. A man. Tall. Weathered. His face carved with the weight of years. His piercing eyes locked onto Daniel. "You've brought him here." The man's voice was neither welcoming nor surprised. It carried the weight of someone who had been expecting this moment. Daniel hesitated, glancing back. The shadows behind them shifted, figures just beyond the edge of the trees. Watching. Waiting. There was no other choice. He stepped forward, pushing the boy ahead of him. The old man moved aside, gesturing them in. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut. The whispers outside stopped. Silence swallowed the night. Daniel turned, chest heaving. "Who are you?" The man studied him, then looked at the boy. "More importantly," the man said, voice grave, "do you know who he is?" The cabin's air was thick with the scent of old wood and burning oil. The lantern's glow cast flickering shadows across the walls, deepening the creases on the old man's face. Daniel steadied himself, his body still trembling from the chase. The boy clutched his side, panting, his wide eyes darting between Daniel and their mysterious host. "Who are you?" Daniel asked again, his voice low but firm. The old man ignored the question. Instead, he knelt before the boy, his gaze sharp, studying him as if searching for something unseen. "Do you know who you are?" the man asked, his voice gentler now. The boy swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of the question. He shook his head. The old man exhaled slowly. "You will." Daniel felt something stir inside him, a whisper, faint but urgent. It pressed against his spirit, nudging him toward something he couldn't yet see. "What is this place?" he asked, glancing around the cabin. The walls were lined with old books, faded maps, and an ancient wooden cross that hung above the fireplace. The old man stood, eyes still on the boy. A refuge, a place of waiting. He turned to Daniel. "You were meant to bring him here." Daniel tensed. "Meant to?" The old man nodded. "From the moment you heard the first whisper." The word sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. He thought back to the first night, the voice that had called him, the inexplicable pull that had led him through the storm, through his doubts, through his fears. "What do they want?" Daniel whispered. "The ones outside?" The old man's gaze darkened. "To stop what is coming." A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the wooden frame of the cabin. The shadows beyond the window stirred, shifting in unnatural ways. Daniel's fists clenched. "Why him? Why this boy?" The old man sighed. "Because he carries something powerful, something the darkness fears." He turned to the boy, resting a hand gently on his shoulder. "You don't remember now, but soon you will." The boy shivered. Daniel's pulse pounded. He had been running for so long, searching, grasping for truth in the darkness. But now, the truth stood before him, wrapped in mystery. And the darkness wasn't finished yet. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin. Then another. The old man closed his eyes. "It's begun." The knock came again, harder this time. The walls of the cabin seemed to tremble with it. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The boy flinched, pressing against him. The old man, however, remained still, his face calm, his hands resting lightly on the wooden table. Outside, the wind howled, but beneath it, Daniel could hear something else. Whispers. Low, insidious murmurs slithered through the cracks in the wood, coiling in the air like smoke. They were here. Daniel took a step toward the door. "We can't just sit here." The old man lifted a hand, stopping him. "You don't fight shadows with fear, son." A third knock, heavy and final, echoed through the room. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting jagged shapes against the walls. Then, silence. The old man turned to the boy, his voice steady. "It's time." The boy's eyes darted between them, fear flashing in their depths. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. Daniel felt the weight of those words. He knew them too well. But before he could speak, the old man knelt before the boy, gripping his shoulders gently. "You don't have to know," he said. "You just have to believe." Something shifted in the room, a stirring in the air that prickled against Daniel's skin. The boy's breathing slowed, his small hands clenched. Then the whispers outside rose to a shriek. The old man turned his face toward the door, unshaken. "They are afraid," he said softly, "because light is waking." A sound like splintering wood cracked through the cabin, not from the door, but from within. Daniel turned, his heart pounding. The wooden cross above the fireplace was glowing, its surface splintering apart, but not in destruction. Something was emerging from within it, light, pure and golden, spilling out like a river. The boy gasped. Daniel shielded his eyes as the radiance spread, filling the cabin, pressing against the walls, surging outward like a tide. Then, the door burst open. But it was not darkness that entered. It was dawn. Brilliant and blinding, the first light of morning flooded the forest, washing away the shadows. The whispers outside faded into nothing. The storm that had loomed so heavily was gone, replaced by the hush of new beginnings. Daniel exhaled, his hands trembling at his sides. He turned to the boy. The fear in his eyes was gone. The old man smiled, standing slowly. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, his grip firm, reassuring. "You were never alone," he said. Daniel swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. For the first time in years, he believed it. The whispers had led him here, not to fear, not to despair, but to light, to purpose, to redemption. And as the sun rose over the treetops, Daniel knew his journey was only beginning.